Welcome, everyone. Today, we're thrilled to have Dr. Saumya Agarwal with us, an esteemed art historian and cultural studies scholar. Dr. Agarwal specializes in the fascinating world of wall paintings from the 19th and 20th centuries, particularly those found in the merchant houses of the Shekhawati region in Rajasthan. Currently, she is conducting ethno-historic research on the painters of the Shekhawati region, supported by a grant from the India Foundation for the Arts. Her innovative approach to visual culture not only illuminates artistic practices but also offers a rich lens through which we can explore socio-historical narratives. We welcome you to this interview today, ma'am.
Thank you, Prabhup. I'm so happy to be here. I enjoy any chance to talk about Shekhawati. So, yeah.
Thank you. So, as we delve into our discussion today, we'll touch upon the broader theme of art, culture, and gender, a timely exploration of how these domains shape society. We're very excited to hear your thoughts and insights on the intersections within the world of art. So, to start, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how gender and art influence each other in artistic practices and narratives. In what ways do you think they shape the stories that are told through art?
Okay, thank you for that question, Prabhup. So why don't I begin? Since my area of specialization are wall paintings of the Shekhawati region, I think I'd really want to answer this question from that perspective, particularly as linked to the kind of research that I'm doing on the painters of Shekhawati, right? Um, so Right. I mean, now Shekhawati paintings came about in, say, from between 1850 to 1950. So they're not like ancient past, right? They're pretty modern. They're very new in some ways. But through my research, what I found out was A, very little is known about the artists in general. And that's really a question of subaltern histories, right? So in my research, I'm trying to excavate the identities of these painters. A lot of these painters belong to what is known as the Kumhar community, which are the potter community. So as a result, what happens is that these paintings and these buildings are known by the identities of the merchant patrons who sort of commissioned these buildings, right? And they're the Marwadi merchants, right? So the first sort of hurdle one faces is one of caste, where subaltern histories of painters who belong to, say, artisan castes, it's very, very difficult to excavate their identities. And if you add the idea of gender to it, right, it becomes almost impossible. So the only way I can sort of talk about gender and art in the context of my research is the complete absence of the presence of women in archives, right, in material traces, um, which should really alert you to something, that histories of women and women artists are not recorded, just like histories of caste subaltern painters are not recorded. So one of the ways that I excavate the histories of the painters is I look at inscriptions on the wall paintings, right? And that has their names on it sometimes. Or I visit families of erstwhile painters and things like that. That's how I excavate the identity of the painters. Official archives don't offer us anything, right? Historical archives. And so you can forget about finding the names of women, but Prabhu, where we do find mentions of women, and that's why I really like your question, because it has the word stories in it. It's the stories where information of women being involved in art practices in 19th and 20th century wall paintings really slips in. So I really wanted to share this one story with you. Um, so you won't find their names, you won't find anything, but one of the things I try and figure out is how long did it take for a building to be painted? Now these are magnificent havelis and temples, right? So I try and figure out how long it took for a building to be fully completed. One of the stories that I heard was there was a woman who was part of the laborers there who were working in the Haveli. So when the Haveli started being built, that woman was pregnant. And when it was completed, and she had a girl child, and it was completed, when that child was ready to be married, right? And we're talking about, like, say, 19th century Rajasthan, so child marriage is probably common. So one is assuming it took about 7 years for the story, for the building to be completed. But what we get from this story is that women were involved. They were involved in the building of the building. They were involved in, say, things like grinding the paste, grinding the lime. So that kind of material labor women were doing. And you get stories about how there was a husband and wife who painted this Haveli, right? Um, so why? So I would say that if one really needs, if one wants to think about gender in art, not in the contemporary world, but from a historic point of view, then really start looking at stories, really start looking at oral histories, and of course, visual sources. I think we'll cover that maybe in your next question. So I'll just stop here. Yeah.
Mhm.
Mm.
So right now, since you gave us a very specific context of how your research sort of intersected with gender and art, I would like to move on to a broader perspective. How do you believe that gender discrimination affects women artists as represented in art history? And do you think that they faced any challenges, or how did this actually shape their visibility?
Um, Again, sorry. So basically, the kind of discrimination. So I think, Prabhu, it would really depend on the time period you're talking about. If you're talking about contemporary art, for instance, right? Uh, then it'll be challenging for me to sort of answer that question, because I really do look at artists and artistic practices from a historical point of view in South Asian art, right? Um, of course, then, if you talk about contemporary times, from the little that I know, uh, I think women artists face the kind of challenges that women in most workplaces sort of face currently, like the glass ceiling, for instance, and even this sort of aura that we have associated with women artists, for instance, with male artists, right? You get this cult of the personality if you look at a Picasso or a Raja Ravi Verma, and it doesn't happen so often with a female artist. They're really on the margins of these narratives. For instance, I talk a lot about Amrita Sher-Gil in my class, right? A contemporary of Picasso and Gauguin, and really quite a terrific figure. So much so that the entire National Gallery of Modern Art came up to accommodate her works, right? And it's surprising how little my students know about her, right? And then there are art historians who sort of argued from Amrita Sher-Gil till, say, Mrinalini Mukherjee or Nalini Malani. There was such a huge time period where hardly any big women artists and their names came up in the context of South Asian contemporary art. Now, that's a huge problem, but I think it's also being addressed these days. For instance, I know that not so long ago, Bikaner House had an exhibition which was all about women artists from Baroda Arts, right? So these really proactive steps would help make women artists far more visible. And then, of course, this question, I mean, there are all these, yeah. So I think I hope that answers your question a bit. Yeah.
Perfect. I think, in fact, I really liked how you added a positive element, because usually when we hear about anything in the context of gender or any other um industry, it's usually sort of not very motivating to hear about. But it's really nice that you could actually give us a positive perspective and how things are actually changing. So, in light of these few challenges that you just mentioned that women artists do face, do you also feel that art could possibly serve as a tool for healing and empowerment of marginalized genders, so as to say?
Uh, Okay. So one of the ideas, I think it really can, right? But I think, Prabhu, it really depends on who is the gender of the artist. Like, I'm really one of those people who completely believes in, um, if a film, for instance, um, is talking about gender issues. I'm not saying that male directors cannot direct it. Chances are it'll be a lot more sensitive. It's if it's a woman who's directing it, and we've seen those examples in cinema a lot. Um, And similarly, I feel it works in art as well, right? People belonging to marginalized, why just genders, but people belonging to particularly marginalized groups, systems should be put in place that they are able to tell their stories rather than other people sort of telling their stories and profiting off it, like making an academic career out of it or making an artistic career out of it or a photography career out of it. Like, so for instance, one really needs to think about the problems with street photography and the ethics of that, right? So I think the change that, and I think art can be really instrumental in bringing about a change, right? Any form of visual culture, because images have this kind of, you know, this kind of speed, this kind of motility, which you don't find in any other medium, that they can really change mindsets. So I think one of the ways that it can happen is instead of women being represented in art, women start creating more art. And an ecosystem is created where women are in positions of power and administrative, artistic, everywhere. Like, we just need more women, and particularly at Jindal University, where almost all the deans are men. So, we have to think about things like this when we talk about gender. Yeah.
Perfect. I really like that answer. So this is the next question is sort of something that I personally wanted to ask you, looking at all of your research work. So since you've
Mhm.
specifically focused on the Shekhawati region, did you in your research career face any sort of challenges or anything that's interesting and that you would like to share with our audience?
Absolutely. So, for instance, thank you for that question, right? Because one of the things that, uh, again, we have to understand, and that's why my very first question started with the idea of subaltern histories, right? Um, Even when we talk about gender, right, we have to talk about this sort of intersectionality is such a word that's bandied around all the time, but we really have to. So, the problems that I would face as a person who's coming from a very urban context, who was being funded by a German university, and he was all this sort of, cultural capital and sort of also real cap. Like, I did all my field work in my car. The problems I would face in a region in Rajasthan where I did my field work vis-a-vis a woman who does not have all these privileges would face are two very, very different categories, right? So that's something that we have to always be aware of. That said, even with all the support system, the support sort of ecosystem that I had around me, doing fieldwork in Rajasthan, for instance, it wasn't difficult for me per se, but there was a lot of fear around it. For instance, fieldwork for me involved walking around in these towns with my camera, with my tripod, going from Haveli to Haveli, going inside spaces, photographing these buildings. And as a woman, and a woman who's grown up in Delhi, we're just so full of fear all the time, right? I mean, that I would always make sure that there was somebody with me, somebody local with me. It actually slowed down my fieldwork tremendously, because sometimes the person who was helping me out would not come up. It made my fieldwork also extremely expensive, because then I had to pay for that person's salary. I had to find a reliable person. So navigating all of those issues, even though if anybody wants to do fieldwork in Shekhawati, I would say the Shekhawati towns are very warm and welcoming and safe spaces. But when I was doing their field work there for the first time, I did not know this, right? So that fear, where I had to I couldn't just walk anywhere and do my work and live in these villages and small towns of Rajasthan, really slowed me down.
Perfect.
Okay. Okay, so like I said, we also need to make our own networks. So, for instance, if now anybody contacts me, particularly a woman, about wanting to do research in Shekhawati, I'm so happy to guide them, put them in touch with the families that I know of, and really sort of tell them how to navigate that space. So, I think these sort of bonds of sisterhood in academia are really required, and we should work towards that.
Yeah, I think these are some challenges that we all actually face on a day-to-day basis, but they're very like they aren't spoken about much. And I'm glad
Yeah.
we could like put it forward and actually talk about them.
Mhm.
Lastly, do you see art fostering greater social change around gender issues, and what do you see in the future?
Mm, okay, so Again, I will not talk so much about contemporary art can sort of really foster social change as well. I mean, we have more women artists who are acquiring fame and who are producing really, really compelling work. Um, uh, for instance, I mean, even Amrita Sher-Gil, I mean, she's not contemporary, but she's a modern artist. Amrita Sher-Gil's work in the way, or Frida Kahlo's work, right? The way they talk about gender, sexuality, sexual identity. And one of my favorite paintings, which I discuss a lot in my class, is a self-portrait of an artist as a Tahitian by Amrita Sher-Gil, right? It completely shifts the way we say consume and look at women's bodies when the women themselves sort of depict the whole genre of self-portraiture when it comes to women artists is so powerful. Like a nude painting done by Amrita Sher-Gil of herself really completely subverts ideas of the male gaze and desire, um, and all of those ideas. So when it comes to gender, I think key women create more works about women and about gender, and that's absolutely essential. But I think also from an art history perspective, because that's very important for me, I think increasingly more and more scholars are doing very innovative work to sort of, particularly in the context of Rajasthan, to understand female patrons of the art, right? If somebody is working on the female artists, somebody is working on female patrons of the art and looking at archives to sort of excavate that information. So I think all of these things are very important. And this is how I think both art history and visual arts in general can create change.
Perfect. And with that,
Okay.
we unfortunately come to the end of today's interesting discussion. I think your views have greatly inspired us today. And also, since I was actually looking forward to this, it has inspired me greatly. And on behalf of Team Swabiman, I thank you for taking out time to be here with us. The interview will be posted on our website shortly, and we'll notify you of that. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Prabhu. This was delightful. All right. Okay. Bye bye. Prabhu, is this? I think there's been.
Yeah, yeah.
Hello.
Now I
Yeah.
can. Perfect.
Okay.